You are listening to People of Color in Psychology. For those who are interested in supporting our work or making culturally informed practice a part of your ongoing journey, we are offering a 50% discount on continuing education courses at the Multicultural Counseling Institute. When you register for a post-test, during the checkout process, enter FRIENDS50. That is all in caps, FRIENDS50. Again, thank you for your continued support, and onward to today's episode. You find yourselves at a crossroads where the well-worn path of familiarity meets the daunting, overgrown entrance to the whispering woods of self-doubt. Before you, a weathered signpost points in two directions: the familiar path and the whispering woods. You sense that the familiar path might not be built for you, as your journey has been, in most cases, unique and different. As you stand there, observing the signpost, a gentle breeze carries whispers that seems to echo your deepest insecurities. You decide ultimately to venture into the whispering woods, where the trees are gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air is thick with a sense of unease. You notice small, shadowy creatures floating between the trees, with their eyes gleaming with a malicious light. These are the Doubtlings, your first enemy encounter. Doubtlings are small, shadowy creatures that amplify your negative thoughts. The Doubtlings begin to swarm around you, their whispers growing louder. You must roll for wisdom to resist their influence. To succeed, you must roll a value greater than 10. Yes, you succeed. You manage to maintain a sense of clarity, even amidst the chaos. As you traverse deeper into the woods and clear your eyes from your recent encounter, you begin to notice that beyond the woods, you find yourself approaching the shores of a vibrant, sun-drenched lagoon. The water is crystal clear, reflecting the brilliant blue sky. Gentle waves lap against the white sand, and the air is filled with the sweet scent of tropical flowers. You feel a sense of calm and anticipation. A friendly dolphin playfully leaps from the water, as if welcoming you. You can sense that you belong here, right now, in this place. Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. Today, we are joined by Dr. Chris Truong, a licensed psychologist at a university counseling center in Maryland and owner and psychologist at Prismatic Minds, LLC. Dr. Truong specializes in treatment for neurodivergent individuals and received their doctorate and master's in clinical psychology from Loyola University and a master's in public mental health at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Truong is one of the first few folks to design and implement and develop a program specifically for neuro-affirming services across a university counseling center. Additionally, Dr. Truong held leadership roles and was on the Accessibility Advisory Committee, Cultural Competency Advisory Board, and a public health ambassador at the Baltimore City Health Department. In 2024, Dr. Truong received a University Diversity and Inclusion Award. In their scholarly works, Dr. Truong has been involved in research projects, including roles at Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the Behavioral Health Leadership Institute, and has published several papers on community-based interventions. Now, throughout their creativity and commitment to working with neurodivergent people, Dr. Truong even created a Neurodiversity-Affirming Dungeons & Dragons interpersonal process group, executive functioning study skills support group, and a neurodivergent support group. As an Asian American psychologist, Dr. Truong will be discussing neuro-affirming principles with BIPOC populations and ways to apply such framework in the clinical setting. Dr. Truong, welcome and thank you for speaking with us on this podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
You'll have to excuse me a little bit if I clear my throat because I'm getting over a little bit of a cold or sickness.
That's
But we'll
okay. We're human.
yes, yes. So, I really want to hear more about your work in terms of, applying neuro-affirming principles for our listeners. Maybe we need to start with the definition of what is neurodiversity?
Yeah, I think that's a great first question to ask and to ponder on. So, in its most basic definition, neurodiversity just means variations of the brain, right? So, the idea that throughout the world, there is natural variation and differences in the way a person may think, may communicate, and experience the world. And one variation is not better than the other, it just exists. And this term was coined as a way to kind of advocate for neurological minorities when it was coined by Judy Singer. And so this term then evolved through time and history with the disability rights movement to kind of now align and kind of jump from the autism rights movement and the idea of when a person has a neurological difference or is neurodivergent, it's not inherently a bad thing. It's not something to be viewed through a deficit based lens or pathologized. While we can still acknowledge there are challenges that could be associated with being neurodivergent, there are also some strengths involved too, and we should kind of foster that and embrace that. And so it's the idea of we're trying to advocate for marginalized folks who are neurodivergent and try to kind of break through an ableist world. So I think that's more from like a larger social justice lens, but that can also be applied in our clinical work and how we interact and relate and connect with our neurodivergent clients.
So, with neurodivergent clients, in terms of processing information, how is this different than, say, just natural individual differences?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And I think it really comes down to semantics, right? So essentially, if we like zoom back into just looking at the human species, everyone is different. They're like physically different, tall, short, maybe a different color of our skins, maybe also like our health. And also, it extends to the way we process information, the way we communicate and operate in the world. That's like a really bird's eye lens. But we're human beings and we are creatures who want to establish a sort of social order, right? And so there's this idea that was created, what is normal? What is typical in society? And if you really think about what is considered normal, it's kind of just an arbitrary set of behaviors,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And
Mhm.
actions that somehow the majority group selected to be the thing that people should aspire and become. And anybody else who falls outside that set of normal standards, I put normal in quotes, then they're viewed as different, divergent, and probably ostracized on a bad thing. But it's not necessarily true. So, in I guess a philosophical sense, there is no difference. We're just kind of selecting differences to be in the hierarchy better than another. And so by taking kind of like a neurodivergent affirming approach, we're trying to reduce that hierarchy and just
Wow.
try to say there's a difference there. And maybe it's just this world is built in a way that kind of favors or is more aligned with a certain set of behaviors and not a neurodivergent set of behaviors, for example. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for really showcasing and discussing the core of this hierarchical view
Hmm.
of what society perceives as acceptable,
Hmm.
and then discarding essentially the other behaviors that are so-called unacceptable.
Yeah.
Really bring that out in this neurodivergent principle,
Hmm.
and really also appreciate the pretext because that's going to help us, our listeners, understand more. Oh, we have a common language here, so we can
Mhm.
move forward. Can you tell me more about your existing work and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently a psychologist at College Counseling Center. And I also have my own private practice called Prismatic Minds LLC. And so a lot of my work is centered upon providing neurodiversity affirming care. So this is relatively new. Like, I don't think many people in the world or the country know much about like one neurodiversity in itself as like a social movement, but also like in the framework of clinical care, what that could look like. And so my hope is to kind of use and embody neurodivergent affirming principles, which include things like what I mentioned. There is no one better brain than the other, right? And it's not a deficit way of looking at a person's neurological functioning. It's more of a strength based lens. And also, it's centered all about empowerment, autonomy, and how we can empower someone to advocate for themselves while also adjusting the environment around them to reduce ableism, right? Because it's really difficult to work in a world that wasn't built for you. So a lot of my clinical work is working on a one-on-one basis with a person who may be wondering, hey, am I neurodivergent? And I wonder if it would be helpful for me to kind of talk a little bit more of like what counts in quotes as neurodivergent, because I think the definition of it may differ depending on the clinician and where you land in the philosophy of
Yeah.
neurodiversity.
Yeah. Can you go ahead and discuss that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were to straight up go with the clear cut definition of neurodiversity is natural variation of the brain. So technically, if the largest umbrella, it would include all different types of neurotypes. So it could include like autism. Of course, that's a classic one that many people think of when they think neurodivergent, but it could expand to much more, such as like ADHD, learning disabilities, and then some folks even expand it even further if we're going to take the brain difference into mind. So maybe it includes brains that have been changed by trauma. It may include brains that have been changed by traumatic brain injury. And if we were to expand it even further, the umbrella, some people even view it as including bipolar disorder or even mood disorders too, because in some capacities, our brains can be different from these experiences of having depression, anxiety, and like trauma, for example, too, which is often associated with a lot of these experiences. So I tend to take my approach in the clinical work as affirming and as open as possible. So like if you have a brain difference, whether it be like autism or bipolar, and you're noticing that, hey, I feel like there's something different from me. Oftentimes when I talk to clients, they have a classic theme of like, sometimes I feel like I'm performing all the time with everyone around me. Sometimes I feel like I'm an alien and like I speaking my own language and no one else seems to understand what's going on. Sometimes I feel really exhausted because I don't know which version of me to choose for like a social event. And so there's like some themes there that are very shared amongst neurodivergent people. And so I accept that. I'm like, okay, it sounds like if you choose, you identify as neurodivergent. And while of course there are some circumstances where you can have like an official formal diagnosis that may align with the DSM, but sometimes the DSM is limited in its diagnostic ability. It doesn't capture the full range of what neurodivergence can be, or even just, like, for example, autism. It doesn't capture the full range of autism. And so, knowing the limitations of formal diagnosis, I still want to take an approach where a person can still acknowledge there's still challenges there, right? Like, I don't have to be formally diagnosed as autistic, but still recognize that there's a disconnect here, and I'm having a really difficult time. So, you may have some maybe autistic traits, for example, and that's also okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And
Yeah.
so, that's
It,
kind of where I'm coming from.
it sounds like you're also helping clients differentiate between, I guess, differentiate between neurodivergence versus DSM diagnosis.
Yes,
Because I
absolutely.
think that there's an overlap. DSM just
Hmm.
by nature captures and encapsulates certain behaviors, and that
Hmm.
creates the diagnosis.
Yes.
But you're talking about brain processing, brain
Hmm.
information, which
Hmm.
then leads to certain behaviors. So those
Yes.
are two separate things.
Great. Yes, I'm so glad you bring attention to that, because while the DSM is a very helpful tool for diagnosing and kind of getting a sense of like what a person may be experiencing in their symptoms, you got to ask like who created the DSM, right? And for why are these diagnoses created? For an example of like autism, I bring it up a lot because I think a lot of my clients are autistic. They For autism, a lot of the set of the symptoms or the criteria that you see, you notice it's more like externalizing behaviors that are just kind of like, I say in quotes, or like not, I don't really mean it to be, but like viewed as a problem, right? For
Right.
like everyone
Is it
around
socially
us.
acceptable? Right.
Yes. And
Right.
so the whole criteria is just based off you being a problem for like a group, which is really painful and pathologizing. And so it only captures a certain set of behaviors to put a label on it. But, the autistic experience is much more than the criteria. Now I think there's a shift in kind of viewing autism instead of like low autism versus high autism, or high support needs and low support needs. Is now a shift in language now of viewing autism more like a kind of like a spiky profile where there's certain domains of different behaviors, and where you land in that domain is your flavor of autism, so to speak. And so that's so much more nuanced than the DSM criteria.
Mhm.
And I don't want to completely say the DSM is bad, right? There is functionality within a world that is built on a medical model. And sometimes, like to get care, like formal medical care or services, you need a diagnosis attached to your experience to get whatever you need.
Yes, to get those services,
Mm-hmm.
funding needs,
Mm-hmm.
also accessibility. I guess what I was also going to point out here too is the DSM is also evolving.
Yes.
There's always updates, so at
Mm-hmm.
some point in time it will evolve. So now you're discussing using the neural affirming principles, and when we're also talking about using these principles in a clinical environment for BIPOC populations. Can you walk us through your observations and how you would do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you're asking this question, because I feel that a lot of BIPOC folks are missed when we're asking the question of whether or not they are neurodivergent. And if we just start with like the most basic formal way of getting a formal diagnosis through an assessment, that route in itself is so inaccessible. Assessments can be very expensive, right? Assessments can take a really long time and have huge wait lists. And also there's like stigma associated with getting a diagnosis or going through an assessment that maybe is more like culturally connected. So that's like one like pathway where we miss a lot of BIPOC people. But also, even if a BIPOC person ends up having an assessment, right? Like walk through the doors, they get through all those barriers. Then there's the additional barrier of medical bias, right? So the clinician themselves, or even the instruments being used, they might not be attuned to the like a more BIPOC sample, or even BIPOC and gender diverse sample. I'm going to put that out there too. And so maybe a clinician would look, let's say, at a Black child, right? Or a Black young adult, and say, like, oh, okay, you're experiencing all these things. They're like externalizing behaviors. Oh, they're like running around, they're like yelling at the teacher, or they're not listening to a parent. And immediately their brain, because of of a bias of related to race, they would say, oh, that child probably has like conduct
ODD is the most common.
ODD. Yes, yes,
Yes. Yes.
ODD, conduct disorder.
Yes.
We're about to go into antisocial disorder when they keep growing up. And so that's problematic, right? So immediately they just start slapping that label onto a young BIPOC child, when actually they should pause and consider, wait, maybe it's not ODD. Maybe it's not conduct disorder. Maybe instead it may be autism, right? Maybe the child may be actually having a hard time adjusting to sensory related concerns. And that's why they're having a meltdown or a tantrum in response to whatever is going on. Or maybe the person may actually have ADHD, right? Maybe they have a lot of hyperactivity going on and it's just really impulsive. And oftentimes clinicians don't stop to think through the nuances of that, and they just immediately prejudge a client because of what race a person may be or gender. So same with, let's say you have a female girl, right, going for an assessment, and there's the idea that still exists, unfortunately, that like autism or ADHD may not exist in girls, right? Oftentimes it looks differently for a young girl versus a young boy. And so clinicians need to be mindful that the experience of growing up as a girl is very different and as this being a young boy socialized in life. So a young girl, they need to learn to adapt to like camouflage and mask socially in order to like interact with other people, and they're required to learn how to be more attuned in a conversation and like practice behaviors that are viewed as more like neurotypical conversational skills. So they're very good at masking, but that doesn't mean they're not autistic, right? And so the repercussions of masking can lead later on the line, if they're missed, into really bad depression, anxiety, maybe thoughts of wanting to die, or even losing a sense of self because that child has just been masking for so long with no supports. So these are just some examples of how like clinical bias can kind of already miss a person. And then the third layer, of course, is the cultural layer, right? Like me personally, I remember growing up and I remember my dad, because I'm Asian, right? So my dad saying like, oh, when I was in Vietnam, like ADHD did not exist. There was just no ADHD at all. And so he's like, I don't understand why there are so many people walking around saying they have it, because it's not a thing. And all you need to do is be really strict, very disciplined with the child, make them study hard, and then the ADHD would go away. And that, unfortunately, is not correct, right? And it's actually a very like stigmatized way of viewing mental health. And I don't blame him. He was raised in a different country, and that's the way that the culture believed in that set of behaviors. And so now, though, we aren't living like that anymore. We have learned a lot about, let's say, ADHD or neurodivergence in general. And so, like, I'm hoping that there is less stigma associated with, one, just going to mental health services. Two, maybe getting a diagnosis if it benefits you, because there are circumstances where it may not, and that's okay. And three, if it's like, I hope it's just okay for a person to claim that label or identity. I'm viewing neurodivergence as identity here. So a person can feel more connected to a sense of community. Because once you like identify as neurodivergent, there's a whole world that opens up, and people that can understand what you're going through, really, really like see you for who you are and embrace and accept you for your like what you do, what you like, and how you operate in the world. And that can make such a huge difference.
Hmm. There's a greater sense of acceptance when you're connected to the community.
Yeah.
So we touched on, or you touched on the assessment, because usually
Mm-hmm.
that's the first phase in
Mm-hmm.
entry for psychological services.
Mm-hmm.
And once you move beyond assessment, can you, just for the sake of time and our
Mm-hmm.
listeners, can you give a concrete clinical example through either like an intervention or an interaction that you
Mm-hmm.
yourself have applied and
Yeah,
noticed, oh, this is what I am thinking through and how I implemented in session with a BIPOC client?
absolutely. So I would have a BIPOC client walk in, right? And could observe that they seem anxious, a bit nervous. They're not making eye contact with me. They may be kind of like fidgeting a lot, or they may be like more like might take longer to respond to my questions, or they may be talking in ways that maybe it may be deemed from a clinical standpoint tangential or circumstantial, right? And so I don't pathologize that. Like even in my notes, I don't pathologize it. I just write like, hey, this is observed. And they would talk to me. Sometimes they'll apologize immediately and be like, I'm so sorry. Eye contact is really difficult for me. I just can't do it. And, some clinicians may view that as like a bad thing, right? I welcome it. I say thank you for letting me know. And I want to relieve that pressure of making eye contact with me. Don't feel like you need to mask and look me like all the time when you're sharing with me. I understand that there may be different ways that make you more comfortable to connect with me. And I am open to that. Do you need a fidget? I have a bowl of fidgets in my office, and I take one myself to show that like it's okay. I'm like, I'm gonna pick this fidget. Do you want one too? Because I understand that sometimes it's better for focus. Sometimes it's better for like feeling at ease for conversing with me if they have something in their hands. Or I even say, hey, do you want to just get up and we can walk around the room a little bit? Do you need floor time? Do you just want to lay on the floor right now just to kind of feel grounded? And we could do therapy while you're on the floor. I'm not going to judge you. Whatever your body needs and whatever you feel like your brain needs in order to engage with me authentically, please
Mm,
feel like you have the permission to do that. So that's kind of like an example of like the language I would use in the room with someone. And if a person is BIPOC, I am also even more like affirming. And I'd be like, I know like it can be challenging, right? To like talk with me. Like, I don't know what messages you have received from folks around you about how you talk. Oftentimes people come into me first with the challenge of friendships. They always come in and they say, like, I'm just having a really hard time making friends. And I don't know why. I've tried every single thing under the sun, the full like gamut of recommendations from my friends and family, and I still can't make a friend. And there's something wrong with me. Right. And that kind of gives me like a little boop on my radar saying, okay, yeah, so maybe this person could potentially be neurodivergent, because what's happening is they might be trying to connect with a bunch of neurotypical people who aren't seeing them or accepting them, or might actually be ostracizing them because they have a sense that there may be differences there. And so maybe I need to work on talking about, okay, like, what about you is you? What about you feels authentic to you? Are there certain times and places where you feel connected with people? And then I kind of like distill things down to like more acceptable or more affirming groups of behaviors where a person can be like, oh, yeah, that is me and that is okay to do that. And maybe I need to find more people similar to me that would understand and accept that. And it's harder to start with these conversations with like a BIPOC person, because oftentimes growing up, their family may have categorized it already as a different thing.
mm.
Like that person just is just the quirky one, or that person,
Yes, been
like,
labeled. Yes.
yes, right.
Yep.
I'm just the
Mhm.
kind of like a little special. And then that's just the way that they've been walking around, living their life. But that doesn't necessarily have to be like that in a negative thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that clear
Hmm.
example because, I think I say for myself, I mean, while I've heard about neurodiversity
Hmm.
and neuroaffirming principles,
Hmm.
it, I haven't really had the time, like most
Hmm.
clinicians, to really dig into, well, what does that look like in a therapeutic space? How do we
Hmm.
apply that?
Hmm.
And, like many of the SOAP notes or EMR notes or
Hmm.
that we had to write, is like, oh, tangential conversation behavior, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Circumstantial, right? And we
Yeah.
just kind of put it on there without thinking, oh, wait, maybe this is just a way of being and there's nothing right or wrong with it, but it's just a descriptor.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so share with us any memorable events and circumstances that influenced how you got into this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about that question, I think two memories pop up into my mind. The first one is like earlier in my life in high school. I actually was diagnosed with Bell's palsy, and that's a condition where like half my face was paralyzed. And fortunately, it passed after like a month or so, but that month was a really challenging one. It really, really opened up my eyes to a lot of the things I took for granted related to my body. Like I had to tape my eyes shut at night because there was a fear that if I didn't do that, I would lose vision. Or I couldn't like drink from a cup because half my mouth wasn't able to like do that like motion to hold the liquid. And so I had to kind of like adjust and accommodate with like hopefully like a straw to one side, right? And also beyond the actual like adapting for my body, the social aspect of it was really difficult too because it's so visible. Like people would see me and half my face would not move, and people were not kind. I would just say that. And so that really opened up my eyes of like the experience of someone who may have a disability or is just different, you know, and living in a world that maybe not be built with them in mind. And so that kind of really opened up my heart. And I really wanted to work with people who one like if they have a disability, I want to work and empower them. But two, like different, like view different through society's lens. Like if you're kind of like the outcast, I want to work with you because I don't want to make sure that you don't feel alone. So that kind of was like the kernel, I think, to like my heart.
I mean,
And
it's been
yeah,
so frightening.
yes,
I've had that happen. I mean,
mhm,
no sense of control in what their body is doing.
yes,
And then you're already struggling with that
mhm,
loss,
mhm,
essentially.
yes,
And then also experiencing the social loss,
yes,
people going beyond just, rejecting, also, like
mhm,
you're saying, having some not so nice things said.
mhm, yeah.
Gosh, I'm sorry that happened.
Oh gosh, of course. So thank you for saying that. And I'm glad you understand like the scariness of it and also like the pain of it. And so I'm thankful that I don't like it was a temporary experience for me. But for some people it's not temporary. It's for life, right? Either for like a physical disability or also like in like not apparent disability, right? And same goes for neurodivergence. I know there are some folks who are neurodivergent but don't identify as disabled. But if a person is neurodivergent, they're different for life. This is not something that you can just boop with medication or switch and change it and suddenly everything's fixed. It's who you are. It's integrated. And like how can we look at ourselves in a way that's more self-compassionate and like accepting of who we are, and how can we also educate people around us so they can also be more affirming and less judgmental or shaming or hurtful when they're with us.
Hmm.
And so I think that was kind of like the spirit of that memory there. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And do you want to briefly talk a little bit about the second one?
sure. Basically, it's just a story about my own self-discovery of neurodivergence. And so I was later in life, right? So I'm actually adult, not a kid. And I was in my graduate program, and I was just talking to a supervisor of mine, just sharing about some of my memories and hardships and challenges related to school, related to work, and just like productivity. And then suddenly my supervisor just nonchalantly said, "Oh, I didn't know you had ADHD." And I paused and I'm like, wait, I don't. But then I was like, wait, do I? Maybe. That really opened up my eyes because I never even considered it. And the reason I didn't consider it was because I was still able to reach benchmarks. I was able to graduate, whatever, pass my classes, get my degrees. And so the fact that I was able to attain that, I thought meant I didn't have anything or I didn't have ADHD. But actually, if I really pause to think about it, yeah, I absolutely have ADHD for sure. And I was just working so hard to compensate for the challenges that I was experiencing for my whole life. And if I really think about all the achievements that I have and the background, the back end of it, there's so much wear and tear on my energy, my body, on my like the way that I do with myself that I feel like could have been helped if it was like detected sooner. So like if I were not to perform as well, like I would probably growing up be viewed as less disciplined. Like I wasn't disciplined enough, for example, or I was like lazy, a lazy Asian. And that's the explanation for why I was struggling, as opposed to maybe I just have a neurological difference and maybe I just needed to do things differently. So that experience is very common for a lot of BIPOC people. where like it's not even on their radar as an option, but they still feel broken inside and feel like, why is life so hard? It just seems so much harder for me compared to someone else. Why? And so just offering the framework of neurodivergence to kind of like glom onto and be like, maybe this could be an explanation. Not a bad thing, not a good thing, but just a way to kind of understand.
Yeah, to
Like,
understand and compassionately figure out, oh,
mhm.
this is what's happening. And also, gosh, this label, like
Mhm.
lazy Asian, that's so damaging.
I
Oh,
know.
oh, oh,
Mhm.
yeah. So you've discussed some of the challenges you've experienced in terms of the neurodiversity component, and also you did bring in the race culture side, which is being called the lazy Asian. So I'm curious, with these challenges, were there others? And most importantly, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And yes, there were other challenges for sure beyond the ones I listed. I think being one of the challenges that comes to mind is I am Asian clinician, and there aren't that many of us that exist in the field. And there definitely was not many of us in my training program or where I work, or like even in my like city or state. So it can be a very isolating experience when I'm like the only Asian at my center or at my university or in the area. And it was really challenging, especially like growing up and developing as a clinician for my professional development and personal development, because while supervisors can be supportive, they can try to kind of understand my experience. I don't think my experience as an Asian clinician is exactly the same as like a black clinician, for example, or a white clinician. And there really wasn't anyone there for me to kind of talk about that, like, and connect in a real way of like, yeah, what you're experiencing right now, this microaggression, yeah, that's definitely a thing. Oh, hey, like the way that people are kind of viewing you, yeah, that is definitely a common experience shared by like other Asian people. And so some of the examples that come to mind is, so while even though I am an Asian like gender expansive person, I present female. So oftentimes when people look at me, they clock and they think, okay, woman. And so they view me as an Asian woman. And there's a set of expectations that are kind of baked into that image. And I think some common ones include, oh, an Asian woman, probably very gentle, very soft, very compliant, very demure, and not the good way, the bad way. And so that already pigeonholes me because it's hard for me to advocate for myself. So if I am suddenly put in a place where I need to be assertive and I need to advocate for something that's important to me, I need to be super careful because unfortunately, when people see me being assertive, they actually download it as aggressive
Hmm.
because of their preconceived notions that I need to be gentle all the time. And then so once they download me as aggressive, then I become the other stereotype of like the cold, cruel dragon lady who's like ruthless,
Oh gosh, yeah, the
like,
extremes.
yes,
Yeah.
the extremes. And so like it's very challenging for me to kind of just say things and just have it taken for face value because I just have to go through some conversational dance, I guess, to make it palatable for someone to hear me. And that's been really difficult. But I've learned, like with time and with experience, one way that I could navigate that is to kind of identify certain co-conspirators or allies in my life who just get it. When I say like, I just feel like when I say something, no one actually listens to me. They will, in meeting or group spaces, I would say something. They would also say the same thing to kind of amplify my voice. And then that would kind of be held with more weight and legitimacy. And it's unfortunate that I have to go through so many like hoops to kind of say a point, but I'm glad there's like people there who can do that for me. And then also I play that role for other people too. So like if there is someone, let's say like a black staff member, a black clinician who's saying something and may not be as viewed as, seriously. And because of unfortunately the hierarchy of BIPOC
Yeah,
folks,
yeah, the social,
right?
yes. Yes.
because of the model
Yes.
minority myth, right? So
Yep.
I have a power there. I have a privilege there in comparison to my Black colleague. So I have a duty and responsibility to amplify their voice when it comes to it. And so it's kind of like fluid in a way, but I have found like a little network of people where we can support each other. So that's
That's so
one of the
critical.
ways. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And, we can do a whole nother episode on the model minority
Yes,
myth. And
absolutely.
but so, you've mentioned some of the undertone of what you're saying too is to overcome some of this challenge also means allyship,
Yeah.
also means helping others.
Mhm.
So so for you, what does it mean to be an Asian American psychologist?
I think it's really important that I am using my role and my identity as like an Asian psychologist to like further um, support marginalized communities. One, because there's so little or few Asian psychologists. Already me existing is kind of like an example or a model of success for a lot of people who may not even consider pursuing this profession. One. Two, for people who even want to just get services from a clinician, seeing someone who may be more like them, like being Asian too, for example, that can be more approachable and like maybe destigmatizing the work of it. So I am kind of like a more welcoming presence. But three, I also want to name like my intersectionality, right? So like not only am I Asian, but I'm also non-binary and I'm also neurodivergent. That's kind of like threefold there. And I can't even like count how many times when a client comes into my office and they say, "Oh my gosh, you're like the first non-binary person that I've ever met who's like has like authority or power, right? Like as a clinician or anyone in their life." And that like really, really means a lot to them. Or like how you're neurodivergent too. What? That's incredible. What, you're Asian? Wow, you understand what's going on. Those moments, it's so impactful. So I think it's so important for me to like recognize all my identities connected and the power of me just existing. And unfortunately, while that's like heartwarming, it's also heartbreaking, right? Because you would think just me having someone enter my door, just me being, shouldn't have to be such a huge surprise for someone. And like I would rather spend that time like doing more deep work with them, but already just me existing gives an impact. So I hope one day there'll be a time where like a client comes in and like me being the three identities that I listed is no big deal because it's more common,
Mm,
right? And like we'll actually be able to connect on different levels too, in addition to that. But currently, since the state of the field and the people who are in it is not truly representative of like the people in our population, I think it's already important to kind of just highlight that as the importance of my role of being an Asian psychologist.
yeah. Yeah. And how do we support you, Chris?
Thank you for asking. Yeah. So I just want you could support my work by also just learning and kind of leading more into neurodiversity affirming principles in your regular life, right? If you love this topic, if you're curious, I ask you and I like encourage you to empower yourself by self-learning. If you want to go look it up more and read, please do that. And beyond that, if you want to help me directly, then I also have a private practice that I mentioned, Prismatic Minds LLC. And at my practice, I offer individual therapy, group therapy, consultation, and training workshops. So, like, if any of that seems to be something that you'd be interested in working together, I welcome that, and I would love to connect with you. You can find me. I have a Psychology Today profile if you want to work with me clinically, or if you want to just contact me and email me.
Okay. All right, Chris. Well, thank you so much for being on our podcast today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you so much for having me and just having a platform for me to talk about one of the favorite things I love in my life. So thank you for sharing that joy with me.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Their feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.